Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today, we have got Zander Keig with us. He is a frequent guest. It's good to see you again, Zander. Zander, has his consulting company or consulting organization company, would you call it company?
Business, I guess. Yeah.
Business. Keig Consulting. And we also have with us today his friend, Matt Watson. And so Matt and Zander are working together. Matt is also a licensed social worker. Matt works with the Church of Latter-day Saints. So you guys have got some collaboration going on here that we need to know a little bit about. But before that, what did we bring to drink for this conversation? Zander, did you bring anything to the table?
Absolutely. Today I brought a grapefruit Radler, which is, for people who are unfamiliar, a Radler is the German name for cyclist. And what it is, it's a 50-50 beer and grapefruit juice drink that's good for the heat of the summer when you're cycling around the countryside.
That's awesome.
And it's like 90 degrees here and humid in Orlando. So I'm drinking my Radler.
Matt, what did you bring to the table?
Well, I bring to the table a little guava nectar. As a young missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I served in Mexico and developed quite a little affinity for guava nectar. So that's what I've got today, and a little bit of living water as well. So I'm ready to roll.
That is okay. Well, you're a first with your guava nectar. I like that.
There you
go. David, you?
I've got another first coming your way. This is a hard ice pina colada because it is 97 degrees right now in the DC area. So I'm going with ice here.
Whoa! Oh, but is it alcoholic?
Oh yeah,
it is
6.8%.
And you can get those in the store.
I got them in on my way back from the mountains of Pennsylvania into Maryland. So I don't know if I could get them here, but I could get them where I was way out there.
That looks awesome.
Wow.
It's really tasty,
yes.
Actually.
Okay, well, I'm doing something a little different too. I same alcohol as I used before, but I made a root beer float with whipped cream vodka, which I think, Zander, we've talked about my whipped cream vodka before, but now it's root beer and half, so it's a root beer float.
Yum.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Zander and I have laughed about how it's a good thing we didn't have flavored vodka when we were in high school. So, okay, with that said, Zander, take us away with what you and Matt are working on together in your world of social work and belonging and all these good things.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right in. So Matt and I met, it's probably been at least 2 years, a little bit longer. Now, we met through a professional online community for social workers. So it's like a bulletin board or a listserv where people can go in and post questions and ask for advice, or maybe just start a discussion. And so there were a couple of postings that came up within this environment that we were both contributing to. So somebody posed the question around, can you be a social worker and a Christian? I think there was another person posed a question about, can you be a social worker and conservative? And I'd say the majority of the responses, at least initially, were absolutely not. Right? There was a sense in which being a Christian and being a social worker, being a conservative, perhaps politically conservative and a social worker, was antithetical to the profession of social work. Was, I think in some cases, people even mentioned that it might be in violation of our code of ethics as social workers, which it's not. But those were the general sentiments. And so there was a lot of back and forth. And Matt and I were participating in that. And I would think that most people would assume that maybe Matt and I were arguing with each other or coming from very different points of view because, I'm a trans man, and I'm, I do that, work within the community. And, Matt is with the, LDS church, he's a Mormon, and somehow that would make us like mortal enemies of each other. And it turns out that we're not mortal enemies. And we have found quite a nice way to collaborate and work together. And I believe the reason that we started working together more directly is because Matt was approached by a publishing company to publish a book made up of stories or essays from social workers who take a different stance than what was being projected through these ongoing discussions about, can you be conservative, can you be a Christian and be a social worker? Am I correct, Matt? I think that's what brought us formally together.
Correct. We come from different backgrounds. We're in many ways a little bit of an odd couple, but as we have just walked our paths together of seeking diversity and specifically viewpoint diversity and inviting different viewpoints and different perspectives, we've just kind of evolved and developed this great friendship, and certainly appreciate what Zander has shared. Over time, the more we've talked about it, the more interest it's developed from other social workers, and we have a number of contributors who are working with us to just promote that viewpoint diversity through this project and hopefully through a published book.
Well, I think that what a lot of people would assume is they're like, oh, Zander, he's a trans man, he must be a lefty. And oh, Matt, he's a Mormon, he must be a right winger. And it turns out that we're both moderates. And so that's what brings us together, is that we're not polarized in our philosophy, in our politics, and our social beliefs. And that's why, even though we share very different religious backgrounds and affiliations, we're able to work together in the true spirit of social work, I believe, because we're meeting each other where we are, and we're grounded in the principles of working toward making the world better for people, so that everybody, at least as many people as possible, have access to information and resources and whatever it is that they're seeking. And so I think if we are more inclusive of divergent views among social workers, then that makes most sense, because we're working with clients who have very differing views from us.
Absolutely.
And we would not work with them because they have divergent views. Although I think during the Trump administration, there might have been some social workers who felt compelled to maybe stop working with certain clients. I would imagine that came up for people.
Yeah. Things have really obviously escalated over the last few years, and so there's certainly been a few hiccups along the way, and a few challenges with regards to the project, but it's always continued. It's always continued, and I think one of the things that it's helped us to do is to become more fluent in a language that may not necessarily be our personal native language, if you will, ideological language, if you will. If somebody who leans conservative in some arenas can articulate and not develop a straw man argument, but develop a steel man argument, and accurately articulate and appreciate the perspective of somebody who has a different view, it just naturally facilitates relationships and helps us build bridges with each other, and that ultimately is what Zander and I have personally experienced, of being able to just recognize and appreciate those differences.
I think also through the book process, we've received multiple chapters already, and it's amazing all the different topics that are going to be included in this book. I think they'll be surprised. I think they'll learn a lot about, the different ways in which social workers apply the principles of social work and the different populations we work with and the different settings in which we work. and that our lived experience coupled with our education really does determine a lot about the kind of social work we're going to do and from what perspective or what philosophical, field that we're going to be doing that from.
First of all, it's wonderful that you two collaborate, and it's fascinating when people from different ideological perspectives come together and can find synergy and learn from each other and enhance an entire field. That's great. We're in a very interesting ideological moment. Healthcare and social work, by all accounts, have not been spared. There's woke social work now. I was just listening to Barry Weiss interview Katie Herzog about her work in the medical community, how certain doctors will give preferential treatment to minorities in hospitals and so forth, and they're applying sort of an equity standard there. I'm wondering to what degree you're seeing that, you're both seeing that in social work. How much has social work been infected by these latest ideological fads?
Well, I'll just respond with a few things. Some folks who have preferred not to be direct contributors are continuing to contribute and stay involved by sharing experiences. And so we just for an example, faculty from a social work program just reached out to me, and we've maintained some contact where the faculty member just experienced clear ideological leaning in a faculty meeting where her beliefs and others were just blatantly disparaged. And she just felt like she had to be silenced. She just had to be quiet. But her credit, I mean, she's a social worker. She's a real social worker, and so she appropriately spoke to her faculty member, spoke with others, and has had a few reach out and asked to connect with her and expressed appreciation and some awareness and sensitivity to those to her perspectives and so forth. And so I think I think we do need to stand and be able to articulate clearly and respectfully different positions. And part of the challenges that we have with some of the different ideologies that are being put forward right now is that they sometimes, to me, as a person of faith, that it reminds me of my own faith. Not specifically, but it reminds me of a faith rather than my own faith, if you will. That there are things that wouldn't make sense to somebody else, and can oftentimes be challenged, and my faith, I hope that my faith gets challenged, and that people will ask me about it and challenge me on different things or show curiosity to it. But it doesn't seem like we're in an arena right now where you can challenge some of the ideas and the perspectives that are being put forth at this point in time. So she shared examples, some examples of that in her response, which I thought was great. Others have talked about, one example is a young social work student got their degree, and at the end of her degree, she just said, I can't buy into this. I can't do this. So I may practice for a few years, and then I'm going to go I'm going to go into education or do something different because I can, in good faith, espouse some of these things that that have been inculcated to me. Another contributor, his particular, fairly young social worker, he's going to talk. His article or his chapter is about differentiating indoctrination, social work education, and social work indoctrination, and that there is a difference, and that there's a difference between social work and ideological work. There's a difference between social work and political work. And so definitely you're seeing in a number of arenas that specific ideologies are infiltrating and becoming mainstream. And what was previously considered mainstream is mainstream social work is certainly being challenged right now.
So we just talked with Lyle Asher, who gave us a little bit of a preview or a background, if you will, of ed schools and how ed schools have really seeped with ideology and a particular ideology. And we've seen that then transfer into like the school system and then into higher ed. Do you think that there is a certain, because Zander, you started out by saying that there was even a question of whether or not being of a different viewpoint being conservative violated the code of ethics. Do you see, like, in the education of social work, has there become a new kind of ideology seep through that in some ways you might say indoctrinates the education or the education, yes, but the social work landscape?
I think there's so much that goes into it. I can recall in my own MSW program or Master of Social Work program that students could take classroom discussions in a certain direction, and typically the professors would intermediate, right? And they would bring in real world experiences versus perhaps we were discussing, potential circumstances, right? They would bring in their experience of years and years and years in the field versus our brand new experience. And so we also had different ages of people in our classes, and there were several of us who were military veterans, and some were parents, and some were like first generation from like Ethiopia, right? So we had all this variety, all this diversity in our classes. And so that helped to lend itself to opening up the discussions more. But there are some people who are going to social work programs where there's a bit more homogeneity among the student group. And so there may be some diverse thoughts there, diverse experiences, but there may not be as much room or permission or allowances made for that. I feel like it was in my classes, I had allowance for that and people spoke up. I don't know if there were people who didn't also speak up. It's hard to know, but I never really got the impression in any of my classes that our professors were really pushing forward this indoctrination thing. However, I did graduate in 2012, and it could have been happening in other places, but I think I got out right before it really kind of proliferated around the country. I think what a lot of people don't know about social work is that it's very versatile, right? There are licensed clinical social workers who work in independent practice that practice completely on their own. There are social workers who work in the K through 12 school systems. There are social workers who work in hospitals. There are social workers that work in jails, right? You can do social work in a lot of different environments. And those environments are going to contribute to the kind of sentiments that are being expressed and the general opinions about things. And we're also working across the whole country. So if you have people who are working in more affluent areas versus more impoverished areas, rural versus urban, you're going to have people who are advancing, different ideas and making certain resources available to certain populations in their area, because that's the foundation of social work too, is we work with people who are poor, people who are marginalized, and people who are oppressed. And that's not just one group of people, right? Depending on where you are in the country, that those people are going to look very differently. And so it's not going to work to apply the work that we did in, say, Atlanta, Georgia, and then go over to, say, Moscow, Idaho. It's not going to work, right? It's a completely different set of poor people with different issues, different needs, different resources available in their community. So if somebody is formulating their opinions and their ideas and they're advocating certain things from their solo perspective and experience, and they haven't really moved around the country or moved around in social work, they're going to be really limited, but they're not going to know that, right? They're going to think that the social workers everywhere else are seeing the same thing they're seeing, and they're having the same frustrations and the same lack of resources, and it's not going to be necessarily true. So it's like, just, we have to sort of open our eyes, and open up the eyes of our colleagues to say it's different. Social work is different depending on where you're practicing and with whom you're practicing and in what context or setting you're practicing.
I think we're in to the degree that we become ideological, homogenous, or orthodox in our approach, we are creating a very small tent within which social workers can inhabit, can work, can operate. But again, if we go back to that kind of that paradigm of language, if we become fluent in many different moral foundations, many different viewpoints, then we'll be able to engage more effectively. And so, would it be important for me to understand and be aware of David, as you mentioned, woke ideology or different theories? Well, absolutely, because those things are going to speak to other people. And so, have I explored them? Have I looked at them? Absolutely. Do I know what they? Is it my first language? Well, of course not. But I can have an appreciation for it. And instead of taking it, social work historically advocates appropriately for the oppressed, for the marginalized. But if we see the world through a lens of oppression, we're going to find oppression. We're going to look what we look for. We are ultimately going to find, and if we're constantly looking for that, it can create its own challenges. And so again, I think if we recognize that those things, there are some things that there are some truths in some of those ideologies, and we can try and find those truths. We can find some common ground. Great. I think that's at the heart of social work. Some of our contributors are quite good at building bridges with people who are a social work bridge to a conservative legislator. And they essentially have developed some credibility by building that bridge, so that when an issue comes up, the legislator knows who to turn to for perspective. Do we want to really just cut off and cancel different political ideologies because we disagree with them, or do we want to find ways to work together? And ultimately, I think if social work can cease to be primarily political work, there is room for political work in social work, but it's much different. Social work is different than political work. It's not exclusively political. It does include political work, but it's much more broad than that. It's much more broad than ideological work. It's much more broad than a faith tradition or anything like that. So I think there's just, the important thing there is that we just recognize that there's room in the tent, and that's our hope, is that we can maintain some openness, some ideological openness, some differences of perspective, a viewpoint, promoting viewpoint and political diversity in our work together.
There's this concept of having either a prescriptive or an elicitive approach to an issue, right? And so if we walk into the room with the client, or we go, if we're in the community and doing community organizing, and we walk into a room full of people that are disenfranchised, and we say to them, okay, I'm here, I'm the boss, I know everything, and here's what you need to do. We're being prescriptive. We're basically saying, we know what's wrong and we know how to fix it, and if you just do what we tell you, then everything's going to be okay. Well, that doesn't tend to work very well, and it's not going to be very successful for us if we're working with our clients that way. Well, it's not going to work either working with our colleagues that way. Right? The elicitive approach is walking into a room or entering into a dialogue and saying, what's going on here? What would you like to see happen differently? What are the different resources available to make these changes? Who's involved in making these changes? How are people impacted by it? What are your thoughts on it? What would you like to contribute? Right? You're asking from people, not just telling them. So I find that when I'm working with social workers who believe that social workers are social justice workers, right? They are more ideological and they're more prescriptive in that they think they have the right answer for every solution and they just need to apply it and everybody just needs to comply with that application. And it just doesn't work. It might work short term because people may feel like they're forced to comply or they're conflict avoidant. But in the long run, those things aren't going to work. That's more of a conflict based way of handling a situation versus a consensus-based way, right? So there's all these different models out there that we can learn. We learn about different models in our social work school training because one model doesn't work in every setting for every person for every situation, right? It's like
So,
medicine, right?
Mhm.
It's like there's different medicines for the same condition because they impact each person's body differently and each body responds to certain medications differently, right? It's like we have a way that we treat people as well. We call it, we write treatment plans, we work with people in that medical context in a lot of ways, even if we're not in a medical setting.
do you feel that people in the social work field in general have the ability to fight back against this ideology? I mean, I know you just gave an example where somebody did, but to what degree do you feel people have that ability to say, I'm sorry, social work starts with meeting people where they are, understanding where a community is and how they see the situation, not in prescribing an ideology. To what degree could you say that in most settings, and to what degree would you get immediately um, elicit immediate backlash if you did that?
I'll just speak for myself. Um, Among social workers, my experience as, I mean, you're looking at me, you can certainly make some assumptions about, about me and privilege and all those kinds of things. When, being white and cisgendered and straight and, Christian and all those kinds of things, you can make a lot of assumptions about me. But my experience has been that when I respectfully articulate my thoughts, my beliefs, and my position, it's generally gone quite well. Especially at the beginning of this process, of this journey together. Recently, when I spoke up in that same forum, I did get just somebody who's a student, and so I don't know to what degree what her life experience is. I would assume that she's fairly inexperienced. Just lambasted me with all of the labels of patriarchy and white and all the things that they came on and it was, and I just didn't say much more, but it was interesting to see how relatively compared to a few years ago when this project started, there were very few who said anything to her or said, hey, that's out of line, there's no room for that, there's no that's not social work. And so recently, I think, I'm just using one arena as an example. It hasn't been well received. Zander and I, when we presented in March, in that forum that we referenced, they're in Texas. We did a little survey about the ideological, the political leanings and so forth. Of course, the majority lean left, but the feedback was exclusively positive. There were very few negative critical thoughts or critical responses to our presentation where we talked about some of these differences and having viewpoint and ideological, diversity, political diversity in social work. And so my experience has been fairly favorable if we will speak up. We're not probably going to be given, nobody's going to give us a walk in the park. But as we continue to speak up and talk about our experiences, we've had a number of people continue to contribute and with very compelling experiences and perspectives. So generally speaking, David, I think it's a great question. Recently it hasn't been quite like it was, a couple of years ago when this started, but it has been, for me, surprisingly favorable.
I have received backlash, but not from social workers. It's like non-social workers who have taken the sharpest aim at me. But then there's on the other side of it, there's a time when I said something that I wouldn't have thought was at all controversial that raised a lot of red flags. And this was again on that same listserv where Matt and I first started interacting, which was I was at the time working with almost exclusively men as my clients. And I know that men in social work, it's a minority as far as social workers. We're like 15 to 20% of the occupation. And so I raised the issue. I started a thread on asking other men who work primarily or exclusively with male clients what that experience was like for them, and if they wanted to have this little community space where we could talk about being male social workers working with male clients. And I learned through the person who was like moderating the whole listserv that my question, my inquiry had been flagged as inappropriate, and they were requesting that it be removed. And when the moderator or the owner, I think, came back to them and said, no, there's nothing inappropriate about this, and we're not going to remove it. We're not going to censor this. Then the person went out on Twitter. She went out on Twitter and, called me names like I was sexist, a misogynist, only because I wanted to talk with other male social workers about working with male clients. And so, but we know that one, there are fewer men in social work, and two, there's a lot of, you can go out and read research paper after research paper after article, popular articles about how men aren't engaging in therapy as much as women. Men aren't getting their needs met. There aren't enough services for men. So it's like, why wouldn't it be welcome to have men talking about this? It surprised me. I was not prepared for that kind of a reaction from within my own profession about that.
I think as long as we don't get personal and engage in personal attacks, we take a principled approach, I think we're on pretty solid ground, and most people, I think, would agree. And I found that most can talk, but recently there was in that same forum, where people just came out and flat out came after me as a person of faith, as my own faith, and how my faith is antithetical to social work. And again, I just kind of sat back and watched for a little bit, and I was just amazed that nobody would say, hey, this is a group of people, how does that align with the code of ethics? Which is really interesting, because when I have appealed to the code of ethics, the social work code of ethics is very balanced. It emphasizes it nowhere in that does it emphasize equality of outcome. It focuses on equality of opportunity, which is a little bit more in today's climate. Equal opportunity is typically a right-leaning principle. Equality of outcome is a little bit of a left-leaning principle. And in the code of ethics, there's a lot of things that really create a balancing, harmonizing tension. social justice is in the social work code of ethics. It's instantiated in there, and so it's vital. But the code of ethics itself talks about how there's not one social work value or principle, that there's no hierarchy within it. There's not one that's considered above the other. And so there's times to take a social justice approach, but there are also other times to engage the other elements of the code of ethics, the dignity and worth of the individual, the importance of human relations, competence, integrity, service. Those other elements need to be emphasized, not at the expense of social justice, but we don't necessarily need to privilege social justice at all times.
Well, the thing is, being a person of faith and a social worker doesn't violate the code of ethics at all. But calling out another social worker for their religion and saying that it's antithetical to being a social worker or code of ethics, that is a direct violation of the code of ethics. You're not allowed to attack a colleague or discharge a client or patient for any reason that has to do with sexual orientation or race or ethnicity or religious affiliation, political beliefs. Like that's in our code of ethics. So whomever was doing that in that setting, that's a clear violation of the code of ethics. You're not allowed to do that.
I think the point that I might want to emphasize there is that social work has become more ideological. It's moved away from its from its ethical moorings, and these social workers who take this orthodox approach without challenging it, without exploring it, with creating a space where it's a pseudo religion, if you will, where it can't be asked, it can't be challenged. It's just not created a real social work environment. It's creating a very small world in which social workers can operate. And I just think that, like you said, that when I've appealed to the code of ethics, it was amazing how many social workers turned around and said, "Hey, you're not practicing ethically." And my response is, "Okay, help me with that. Talk to me. Challenge me on that. Let me know how to cite the code. Help me see it." But we're not operating in a world right now where many social workers are rooted in those principles, in those six principles I just mentioned.
Yeah. So Jennifer had asked you about education schools. I know from friends of mine who are involved in sort of the mental health field that there's a lot of ongoing training, like there are in many fields. There's continuing education. There are seminars. And if you're in a social work setting, if you work for a particular institution, you're probably getting some online seminar, particularly these days, once a week or once every 2 weeks. What I've seen from some of that is quite alarming. It seems that a lot of it is being done through a quote unquote racial equity lens, which means that it has been infused with a particular ideological perspective. It sounds good to say racial equity lens, but what it means is that they're using a particular understanding of racial equity to train everybody. Do you see that? I mean, maybe it's just where I live or the people I talk to. Are you seeing that in a lot of the training and education you're seeing, or am I just skewing this because of where I live?
No, I would say definitely, David, that is predominant. And I think and while it's possible, I'm not discarding that there may be some benefits that come from that. One of the concerns that I have is that there are multiple ways to approach racism. There is more than one way to deal with racist conduct. And when we take what's currently being labeled as anti-racism and saying that as the only way to approach racism, I think we're compromising our effectiveness in engaging a multitude of approaches that can promote racial equality and improved outcomes for all of us. So I would agree. When you right now to be honest with you, I cannot remember the last time I saw a race, a training to address racism that wasn't CRT or anti-racism, the brand anti-racism, if you will, not the, well, you know what's happened with the hijacking of the term anti-racism. So.
Absolutely.
Do y'all think that you've had any loss of work because of your particular identities? So, or, these labels that we're throwing around. So with Zander from the transgender community, Matt from the LDS community, are there any labels put on you where people might say, I'm going to pass and go with another mental health professional?
For me, no, that's, my employer is,
your employer is the church.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I will say that there are a number of other people, and this is one of the reasons that I feel strongly that I can assume the degree of activity and involvement that I am, because I feel, and I've been told that I am on more solid ground. Other people couldn't promote or take some of the stances that I have without fear and concern for their employers. Some of our contributors have talked very much about that. You're probably aware of some of them who took a hit. 16 years in an organization as a stellar employee, and to be driven out just because you won't worship in the way that you were being asked to worship, and I mean that literally. I think I'm not using that term figuratively. I'm using that term deliberately. That when you're asked to kneel at a particular ideological altar in your employment, that's an interesting dilemma. And so other people have certainly talked about the challenge that it is to stand up and to speak, and I can see that in some of those interactions. But for me personally, I have not personally experienced it.
Yeah, as a consultant, I'm not working for one employer. I work for myself, and so I have. It wasn't very recently. It was within the last maybe 6 months. There was one individual who wrote a very disparaging comment about me on Facebook, and two of the groups that I was working for contacted me privately to question me about the sentiments that were expressed. And they weren't like, oh my gosh, Zander, did you see this? What a terrible thing somebody's saying about you. No, what they did is they asked me if it was true, right? Because that's what people are asked to do, right? You're supposed to believe the person who says, oh, Zander's transphobic, racist, and commits violence against the trans community. That's what a person said about me. And it's like, what? Like, that's the most ridiculous thing. But because terms have been hijacked, violence doesn't mean violence, and racist doesn't mean racist, right? In the way that we have come to understand them up until today. So committing violence means that I said something maybe that somebody didn't like. That's what committing violence is. I caused harm to them personally because they didn't like what I said. I think that's probably what happened. It's been a number of years now. But there are three individuals in particular who have, over the course of about 3 or 4 years, made it part of their job to say disparaging things about me on social media. So what that means is that I stopped all my social media accounts, which limits my ability to reach out to new clients. And I do have a sense in the back of my mind every single day. Is today the day I get canceled? Is today the day I get canceled? It's like a constant. It's a constant. And people said to me, why don't you just go back? And I was working for the federal government where I was basically protected or safe there. Why don't you go back and do that? And it's like, I really love what I'm doing. And I don't want to not be able to do it, but I do think about the cost. But that doesn't stop me, clearly, because I'm doing this podcast and speaking about this topic now. But I know that there could be consequences as a result.
Yeah, it seems to me that certain personalities have a much harder time accepting these orthodoxies than others. I heard Brett Weinstein interviewed at one point about what had happened at Evergreen College. And he was asked, well, why did you do what you do? And he said, I thought about this for months and I realized I really had no choice. I am made up. That's who I am. I have no choice but to be authentic to my own perspectives. And it's interesting. My wife is very into the Myers-Briggs, and she's on these Facebook groups. And she's an INTJ, which is a very rare type for women in particular, and found that almost everyone on the INTJ Facebook group is anti-woke. In other words, it may be that, and I'm speaking to two social workers here, so I'm looking for validation or not. But that maybe we're wired to have certain ideological views. Maybe we're wired to be more accepting of the status quo or more oppositional toward a set of ideologies. Do you have any insight into that?
Well, I'll just say that you and I already had this conversation, and I am also INTJ.
Right.
But it's like, right. I've always been countercultural, right? This is not new about me. When I was a young girl, right? Because I'm a trans man. When I was a young girl, I was very boyish. I was a tomboy. And that was countercultural for my family, right? For being in a Mexican family and wanting to have little, the girls be like feminine. And then I became lesbian, and I was the type of lesbian that was really masculine, and that was really countercultural because I wasn't going with the particular, status quo for what was supposed to be the right kind of lesbian. And then I went into law enforcement, and and I was vegan for a while. Like I have this stream of countercultural component to me, so that when I transitioned and started living in the world, as a man, I started to realize that a lot of the rhetoric and preconceived notions about men that I had internalized through society and through my involvement in lesbian community, I just found for the most part weren't true. That men have been quite wonderful and very, very nice and very welcoming and very kind and very nurturing, compassionate, not violent, like all these different notions about things. And so all of a sudden my counterculturalism, right, this strain within me to sort of go against the grain is that all of a sudden people started calling me a men's rights activist because I was working with men and I was interested in how did mental health issues affect men. What did depression look like in men? What did anxiety look like in men? What did an eating disorder look like in men? Because most of the notions about mental illness that we think of are typically female, right? So it is just hardwired into me. It's just that for part of my life, my countercultural tendencies were in alignment with LGBT community, and now they're not mainstream. There's lots of LGBT people who are heterodox, but not the ones that you see primarily on in social media and on the news and things like that. So there really is something about me that's just runs that way.
Are you oppositional, Matthew, as well?
What was that?
Are you oppositional as well?
Oh no, I'm a conformist. Not exactly. I just kind of do my own thing. I mean, I guess I'm a little bit oppositional. I'd sit in the back of my social work classes and raise, controversial topics or push back on, on some of the faculty, or follow them into their office if they said something I thought was problematic. And so I don't have a problem standing up. I think that, are we wired in a certain way? I do believe that our life experiences, sometimes the areas that we live in, there's so many factors that make up our humanity that 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 it's difficult to say. But Jonathan Haidt's work, I really like that, where he's identified the 6 moral foundations and identified how the people who lean left are heavy in the care and fairness foundations, and people who lean right have a fairly balanced in all 6 of those moral foundations. Mm-hmm. And so I look at that and I think of what are the experiences that people have been through or that they've had, and it helps me have an appreciation for those differences. That if they have experienced oppression or injustice, they are more likely to emphasize care and fairness, and that makes sense. That makes sense. And so it tells me that when I want to engage somebody on the left, I need to emphasize those 2 languages, if you will, where if you're going to engage conservatives, you better be fluent in a variety of those moral foundations. And so in people, I think in my own family, I look at or those that are around me. You can see those who are just more attuned to authority, those who are more attuned to sanctity, those who are more attuned to liberty, those who are more attuned to loyalty and relationships. And so everybody has these different things. And I do believe that those who lean towards the woke likely are very concerned about historical injustices and care and fairness, and trying to restore some of those injustices. But I'm not sure that their ways, that the way that they're approaching it is necessarily effective. And so that's I'm open to that if they can demonstrate effectiveness without it becoming totalitarian and orthodox. Then I would be willing to consider it. I just haven't experienced that yet.
How does social work play out at the Church of Latter-day Saints?
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Church of Jesus Christ it's fine. It's inherent. I mean, it's part of me.
But what are the social work challenges that you face in the church? The specific challenges that you face in the church?
Honestly, one of the foundations is caring for the poor and the needy. Or, that's historically, I think that they're working on a different, term that might not, trigger some different folks. But I work for a department that's called welfare and self-reliance services. That's a department. There's not too many. There's only 4, primary departments in the church, 4 primary missions, and that's one of them. And so it's just natural. It's just part. Mormons were, if you don't mind me using that, well, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have been driven from New York to Ohio to Missouri, finally to Salt Lake. I mean, so we've experienced oppression. It's in, to some degree, it's in my DNA, in my genes. But ultimately, we had to come together. We had to figure out what works. We had to recognize that this is a fallen nation, but compared to what? Can you find a nation where there was more religious freedom, more liberty, more pluralism anywhere else? No. Right. So so essentially, social work is just part of our DNA. It's part of figuring out how to work together. If you don't know any folks of my faith, just go talk to them. If you see the guys wearing the black name tag, or the women wearing that, just go talk to them. They'd love to talk to you. They might try, proselyte a little bit or that kind of a thing, but it just kind of gives them an opportunity. I mean, it just gives you an opportunity to see that we are not necessarily, what would you call it, isolationist? To the contrary, we had to isolate to survive, But now now we do humanitarian things throughout the world. When hurricanes come to the southeast, you've got we just have natural ways of activating hundreds of people to go clean up neighborhoods and those kinds of things. And it's just part of our DNA to serve and to want to be to make a difference in the lives of our fellow men. Now social issues, historically, the LGBTQ questions have been, because you look at those kinds of conflicts and those kinds of controversies. Well, what's that about? Well, that's about kind of this focus on family and the sanctification, or not sanctification, it's the sanctity of the family. And so when you're introducing ways of redefining family and redefining gender and those kinds of things that influence procreation in family, and conservative sexual mores, those kinds of things, it's very traditional, because the family is sacred. And it's not that they're being bigoted, that we're being bigoted. It's just that that's one of the areas that we've that's part of our doctrine or dogma, if you will, is that the family is sacred, that the family is central to the Creator's plan for us. And so when things start poking around with family and those kinds of things, then the church has taken some stances. But if you look now, what's the stance they're taking now? The stance they're taking now is, I won't speak for my church. I'll speak for myself. What I'm seeing happen is the Civil War is over. All right. Marriage is the law of the land. If you want to be pro-family, then let's be pro-family. Let's create families that are stable and helpful. And so there was a time when the church made a decision that didn't want to mess with the family, but it was interpreted through the lens of, you're just a bunch of bigots. And so in an effort to try and honor the family over the church, it got burned that way too. So anyway, we in essence, being a social worker and a Latter-day Saint, they're so compatible. It's just part of our DNA, and it's not just me. I think it's just part of our faith. It's very much about trying to be helpful to other people.
Well, and there's at Brigham Young University, there's a school of social work. There's a school of social work, Baptist schools, Catholic schools. I think a lot of people don't realize that there are people of faith who go to schools, to universities that are built on or supported or foundational to their faith, and then they go out into the world and they work with people of their faith primarily. And so that happens in all different faiths. It's like nobody's questioning if you can be Jewish and a social worker. Right? Why should they be questioning that? The other thing is, I lived in Salt Lake City.
You be a social worker and not be Jewish.
That's
the
true.
question.
When I lived
at least
Salt
in
Lake
my
City,
area, by the way, at least where I live.
I know, in New York. When I lived in Salt Lake
area.
City, I was introduced to Deseret Industries, and I was blown away by talk about welfare and the means of people having access to grocery stores and clothing and jobs and assistance with rent and utilities. I've never seen an organization do more for its people. And I remember when I was there, President Reagan was in office, and he came to Salt Lake City and he did a tour of Deseret Industries, and he said, this is how we should do our welfare system as a nation. Right? Because in Deseret, a lot of times what you do is you have to do some work, and then they give you a little chit that you take to the grocery store and stock up on the food and take it home with no money being exchanged, but you were giving some work. Maybe you were, mowing the lawn at the local ward or something. So I just thought it was really beautiful. And I was living there at the time when I was lesbian, and I was in relationship with a woman whose brother was a bishop in the LDS church. And so I was very closely, I was like 1 degree of separation from that. But it doesn't really make sense to me that people would think that you can't be of a particular faith and be a social worker, because they're not thinking about there's going to be social workers working in at Catholic universities, at Catholic schools, Catholic parishes, Catholic family services. There's going to be, these things, these types of services exist, and so they're going to be.
If they try and shut down social workers who are people of faith, they're just going to shoot themselves in the foot. And unfortunately, that just happened at Karen College or Karen University or something. It's right outside of Philadelphia, where they just closed down their social work program. And it was interesting. On that same forum, we had some social workers who were saying, "Oh, let's write letters and tell them to keep it open." And then a few weeks later, it was like, get rid of them. If they're Christians, then get rid of them. So there's just kind of different perspectives that different people have about faith traditions, and I think if you want social work to be one conglomerate and kind of for it to be federalized, then you're going to, those who kind of lean left, that kind of see it from a large a communal kind of a perspective. That's much different. Where if you see that, social work, a lot of it happens within a family. Social work happens within a family. Social work happens within a neighborhood. Social work happens within a faith community. So if we can learn how to read not just left to right, but right to left. Left being kind of more federalist and large, big government, and right being more of an individual rights perspective. There's multiple ways that you can do social work. There's just not one brand, and that applies to faith traditions as well. All faith traditions need social work because there are different things that happen to help us work well together.
So before I let you guys go, because I'm almost done with my drink, tell me a little bit more about this book, Viewpoint. I mean, this is something novel, right? I mean, has there ever been a book like this before where you're taking a collection of social workers and telling the stories from a viewpoint diverse perspective?
There isn't. There are other elements of diversity, but political diversity is late to the game in social work. It wasn't. It really wasn't instantiated into the code of ethics until this century, and so ethnic diversity, racial diversity, sexual diversity. There's all kinds of elements of diversity, but it seems to me that the viewpoint diversity is one of those that is probably the most critical. Maybe I'm biased, but there aren't any other books like it. We've looked, we've tried to find some, but that's why we're gathering these authors, and we'll probably take an approach where we're going to have to do quite a bit of editing so that a publisher can kind of see what it is that we're trying to do. Our initial attempt, they couldn't quite see, they didn't have our lens to see the coherence of what it is that we were trying to say. And but we have just a number of great people who not only have the philosophy and the first principles, but are out doing the work. They're out doing the work of helping people dialogue across differences and figure things out and engage in civility and civil discussions and challenge one another, but learn from each other as well. And I think I think the world will get better once we start to emphasize some of those skills. And the book has been kind of a magnet for that, and we're looking forward to making it go forward.
That's great. Thank you both.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.